All right, everybody. Good morning. Happy Friday. Chris Bailey is going to be talking today. I don't know if some of you have had the opportunity to meet him already, since I know we're doing like a little bit of neuropsych earlier in the year this year. If you haven't, Chris is our sports concussion guru who we turn to when we need assistance. He does all the in-depth concussion testing and helps us determine when kids are ready to go back. But he's also been in charge of making the transition to Sway and knows all this neurocognitive stuff in much better detail than any of us. And since we're all probably starting to see some Sway tests, I figured we better get Chris here to talk to us fast so we know what we're doing. So slides are recording. I will make sure when it downloads to forward it to everybody to review again. And then just a reminder for everybody that Sway University website does have like just a bunch of short clips that are educational. And most of what we should be doing is the sections on interpretation. But certainly all of them are available for you guys to review. So try and probably take some time this weekend before things really kick into full swing. All right, thank you for joining us, Chris.
Sure, appreciate it. And if you want, I'm gonna see if I can. So I'm gonna stop share real quick. I'm gonna cut and paste into the chat the Sway University stuff, just to make sure people have that too. Go back to it now.
Good idea.
So this is actually so this is where all the courses are, and there are multiple courses that exist there. And it is a useful thing. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen again. Okay, then you guys have the full screen then, right? It's not the presenter mode.
Yeah, no, we're good.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, perfect. So, I mean, I know that we've gone through some of this with at least some of you, but I thought we'd spend a little time just kind of talking about kind of, what we have used in the past. I think there's still some schools that might actually have some impacts that are out there. So I'll just mention that a little bit too, and talk a little bit about some of the computerized concussion testing that we have done. We'll talk about what the Sway tests look like. And we'll review some of the literature. I'm going to kind of speed through that piece a little bit. Again, I think I have reviewed that with some people in the past. And I'll also talk about kind of what we did to evaluate Sway. And then I'm going to spend most of the time, really, I'm hoping to at least half of it, to kind of go through and look at how to go about giving it, so the kind of baseline and post-injury administration, and also the kind of looking at how to interpret it. In a lot of ways, it's similar, I think, to what we'd be doing with Impact. It's just doing it with some different kinds of tests. So we'll go through and we'll look at that. And I've got a couple examples of things. I thought we have time. I'll open up Sway and actually show you how you can look at specific people too, and kind of what the view looks like on your laptop and things like that. So again, you guys are probably mostly familiar with Impact. Previously Impact was the most commonly given computerized test in the past. So something that like kind of like the early 2010, 2015 time frame. It was something like 90+% of schools were using it if they were doing any kind of computerized testing. So a very large proportion of people. Over the years, people have moved away from it some. It's about 25 plus minutes to give it. So it takes a little bit of time. It was originally designed for PC use, so for like a desktop PC. And over time, they moved over to laptops, but it was really supposed to be a mouse on a PC. And when some of the leagues have actually looked at data where people are giving it on a laptop versus giving it with a mouse, there are some meaningful differences, even though the company will tell you that there aren't when you talk to them. But there are some differences in how people give it, in the way that and the data that you get from it. Again, the impact will tell you that you can use, you can do it with 12-year-olds and older, but really the data behind that is if they're under like high school age, the validity behind it, it's pretty bad. Something upwards of like 80% of the tests that you get in the very young kids are actually not very valid. It does have two factors, and there are so a memory and speed factor, but there are five composites that are made of six subtests. So the memory, the verbal memory, visual memory, the vision motor, the reaction time, impulse control, and then there's a symptom score as well. Um, in the way that it's given is you have a baseline, you have a post-injury, and then so you have a baseline, so pre-injury testing. If they have a concussion, then you give it again post. If there is a change from baseline, then it would bold. The change is considered. They look at the 80% confidence interval for change is what bolds it. But again, there are some schools I think that are out there that are still using it. I see every now and then there's some people that where they didn't have a sway baseline, but they did have an impact baseline, and it's like, so what should we do in that circumstance? Just in case people need some, need to give it. I think it's important that you at least have some familiarity with the fact that that's there. And again, we did use even a different test from this even prior to impact. We used ANAM kind of a long time ago because we were able to get it for free. Whereas impact, we started that up. I think it was like 2014 timeframe that we started using that pretty widespread. So why do we think about making changes from it? Like I said, I mean, the PCs really became a thing of the past, with the pandemic. Pretty much computer labs went away. And so we were relying on laptops. And like I said, that really is kind of different from what it was originally intended to be done. And also the companies really pushed for remote testing. So testing on their own, a lot of the school, even our own schools, even though we told them not to do it, a lot of our own schools were still having their athletes test, but at home. My daughter goes to a clinic covered school, and the clinic, I mean, they definitely do testing at home. So I'm making sure that they're in a good testing environment whenever they're doing it. But again, I guarantee you that's not what's happening for a lot of people. And so again, you get some really invalid data that way. Um, we also wanted to look at kind of using updated measures too. So there's a whole lot of additional devices and additional sort of opportunities to get new information. And one of the things with smartphones and smart devices, they have the accelerometers that are built into them that allow us to use a lot of things for both reaction time and balance. And sort of being able to take advantage of that is a useful thing. One of the biggest issues too, that as we started looking into our usage with impact, we realized that there was a lot of our schools that were not being especially compliant as well. Somewhere around 30% of our athletes were not getting any kind of baseline test on impact. So a pretty large proportion. It's like that's upwards of like 10,000 athletes. So it's a pretty large section of people that were not regularly getting testing. In that, and I've done several studies with impact, and it really is just, I mean, painful for the athletes to do it. It's pulling teeth every time we give it to them. So sway is one of the things that we were looking at. There's a lot of reasons why we chose this. Part of it was that some of our athletic trainers had already been doing it and had very good experience with it. Sway's also been something that had some presence at some of the national meetings that I had been at. They also have a reasonable literature base that's already present with it, which we'll talk about. It is FDA approved both for balance and cognitive testing, and it's the only device actually that is FDA approved for both of those things. So the only program, at least, so to have both balance and cognitive testing. It's already been used by like 4,000 organizations and several large hospital systems. There's a bunch of sports organizations that are already using it. Large numbers of colleges and so forth are using it already. It's good for both Apple and Android. There are some normative data, and again, this is stuff that's building, but there's normative data at this point for ages 9 to 70. There are 6 subtests that are used to create 5 composites. Honestly, it's shorter. I mean, it takes 5 to 15 minutes. The 15 minutes actually a baseline, and they actually give it to you a few times. Is part of the reason why, to make sure that it's reliable. And so again, the longest version really of giving it is somewhere around 15 minutes. And then similar to impact, you do a pre-injury test as a reference point, and then if there is an injury, then we'll give it post-injury as well. Um, and we'll go through and talk a little bit about kind of how things are identified too. So there are several different subtests, one of which for SWAY, and one of the newer things for our computerized testing, is that it actually does measure balance, and it basically does a BESS while you're holding the device to your chest. And you'll hold it there, you close your eyes, and you do the different BESS stances. And that allows you to measure balance. It actually measures it based on the accelerometers in the phone. And then after that, it will go through, and like I said, you typically do up to 3 of those to go through and get a sense of things. The cognitive testing on it is far more basic than what it is for impact. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that where these are far less complex kinds of measures. One of probably the most really researched test for SWAY is just a basic reaction time task where the phone will turn orange and then you shake it. So anytime, and it measures how fast that you shake the phone once it turns orange like that. And then there are a few newer tests that they've added. So there's the kind of the original tests really for SWAY, where that balance test and then the basic reaction time test. And now they've added in a handful of newer ones that again have kind of a building literature base behind them. These are really more complex attention and memory style tests. The first one is what's called inspection time, where it shows you 2 different lines. It shows them to you very briefly. It's actually surprisingly brief. If you haven't given it, it shows. So some of them are super fast, and some of them are a little less fast, but they're still pretty fast. So it shows you the 2 lines, and then it covers them up, and then you're supposed to pick left or right, which was the one that was the longer one each time. So that's the one test. The next one is a go no go task. It's called impulse control, and so anytime there's a check, you're supposed to shake it. But if there is a cross, if there's an X that's there, then you're actually not supposed to shake it. So basically, it's showing you a stimulus, and you're trying to decide: is this one where I'm supposed to shake the phone, or is it one I'm not? And then the last one's kind of is the memory test. It's sort of like a Simon Says like task, where it shows there's different squares and they light up in different orders, and then your job is to go through and click the squares in the order that they were originally presented in, and it gets a little long. It gets longer and longer. Again, they're relatively brief. These are not especially complex tasks. That is, I think, somewhat purposeful. On SWAY's part. Again, and we'll talk about how did that. So I can tell you that one of the reasons why. So we took a 2-year time to go through and evaluate SWAY relative to impact, which we'll talk a little bit about. And the reason why we took that time is that I wasn't sure how well the more basic tasks would do relative to the more complex tasks of impact on the kind of evaluating the injury in the way that we want to do. And so I wanted to make sure that even though our athletic trainers that have done this really all had very positive experience with giving this kind of testing, the question of are we going to give up something that's far more useful for something just because it's logistically easier, that wasn't going to sit well with me. And so I wanted to make sure that everything looked right, and we'll talk about what that data showed us. Like I said, there actually is a reasonable literature base behind at least some of the tasks for SWAY, and so we can go through and talk about this. A lot of these tests, they've been around really, since the kind of early 2012, 2014 timeframe. The first things they were looking at with Sway was making sure that their balance testing was actually measuring balance. And so they did actually go through and compare it relative to force plate measures, and the balance testing did align reasonably. Like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these studies. I'm going to just go through and kind of highlight some of the things. There are norms that are available for the balance testing to kind of show, and in general, there are some significant age effects. So you can see that the younger kids tend to improve over time with the more complex things relative to some of the older kids. Yeah, and that's a finding. So age is a meaningful effect on balance, and you'll also see it's also there on reaction time as well. Um, again, there are significant amounts of norms available. Essentially, there are groups of several hundred that are available for the balance testing. There are tests so they actually did go through and study, does it make sense for us to give more than one test? And they did find that with an acclimation trial, with a couple tests at baseline, people do get a little bit better. So there is a little bit of a practice effect just to get used to the device. But then after 2 or 3, then it really doesn't. It stops improving the utility. And this is the kind of stuff so we're approached by many different companies, honestly, to do different kinds of tasks. And what I can tell you is what was part of the thing that, again, was a very useful thing, at least for me, is that with Sway, they've actually done some empirical evaluation of whether or not we should be giving more than one test at baseline, or how they've actually gone through and done some things to study the utility of this in a way that a lot of tests they just kind of do it and then they try to put it out there before these kinds of studies have been done. And so, the reason why, like I said, baselines take a little bit longer compared to the post injuries is that you go through and you give a few tests. And the reason why you do that is because they've shown that actually you do better when you've had a couple trials of it. And then after that, it's about the same. So again, those studies have been done. And so they've actually adjusted then their protocols to align with the research with it.
Hey,
And there are,
Chris,
again, yeah.
with that, after you've established a baseline with the retrials, when you then go to retest someone after concussion or after they've recovered, do you perform multiple trials then as well because
So
of this learning?
yeah, so I would say I don't think you need to, because typically what ends up happening, and we've seen this in cognitive testing generally, is that the practice effect tends to happen for people over the first 2 trials. So you have once and then another time. Beyond that, people don't typically have much of a practice effect. So you kind of learn it to begin with, and beyond that, you really don't have a whole lot of additional practice effect. In fact, that kind of finding was also true for impact in ANAM. And in fact, there were several recommendations for things like ANAM where they said you should probably be double baselining people. But we weren't doing it just because it's very difficult to do. Logistically, it's hard to get people to do it multiple times like that. So the bottom line is, post-injury, I don't think you need to be doing it multiple times. What I would say is, if you get a negative finding, or actually a positive finding, you get something where you see some results, then I would say that we treat it like we normally do, where you give it maybe a day or 2 and then repeat. So we'll talk about that here in a second, but I think that just a single administration post-injury makes a lot of sense. So again, there are reaction times in cognitive studies that have been done as well. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. We'll go through and just talk about these just fairly briefly. Again, the vast majority of the studies that have been done have really been looking at reaction time. And again, just showing that it is correlated with other kinds of reaction times and cognitive processing tasks. Again, there are pretty good norms. Again, if you're looking at these age groups, so this is for the balance testing now that was done in 2020. This study has both balance and cognition. And it's probably the largest study. I think the total sample on this was somewhere around 3,700 athletes. But these ages per year, they were talking about 100 to 300 plus people for these age groups. And the same is true for reaction time as well. So you're actually getting, again, there's a good bit of normative data that exists out there now with this. And I'll actually forward on, I do have some normative data for SWAY that they have sent us that's primarily they're college athletes, but there's really not a lot of difference between the college norms and the high school norms on a lot of these tests. There have been outside people that have looked at whether or not there are significant differences if you're using different types of devices. So an iPhone versus a Google Pixel versus Samsung versus iPad. And the bottom line is that there was not particularly significant differences for the different devices. And there are, it's also interesting is that so Impact has also a smart device test that they have started to look at as well. And the SWAY one versus that one, they're correlated, but they're not really strongly correlated, which is also kind of interesting. And like I said, the thing to hear is that there have been also other outside groups, not just SWAY, that are evaluating these sorts of things. And showing that there is actually this study looked at what, is there a meaningful difference in testing across years? And if you remember, we did SCAT, we looked at SCAT that way too. And from year one, baseline year one to baseline year two, there is a meaningful improvement that tends to happen. And that also happened here in this study too. And so we'll talk about that. I think we're actually encouraging people now to move towards baselining every year. And this is part of the reason why, is that people just tend to do better with a more recent baseline. It's just the bottom line. And so we'll recommend that. And the way that SWAY is actually charged, it doesn't really affect us to do it like that. Though we're gonna be asking our athletic trainers to be giving it a little more often then. This is really the only data that existed at the time when we were looking at it that compared the utility of SWAY and Impact post-injury. And so there's a sample here of 46 athletes who had both SWAY and Impact on the left. And what you can see is that, and it was done within 72 hours. These are college athletes. And what you see is that somewhere around 70% of those that were suspected of having a concussion had a significant decline on SWAY, and about 60% had a significant decline on Impact, somewhere around 58%. And then if they used just a larger sample that didn't necessarily have both of them, so that 286 sample, if somewhere around 65-70% of people showed a meaningful change on SWAY in the post-injury setting, basically at a time where you would expect them to. And I think it's an interesting point to see that Impact at times in that post-injury setting doesn't always have a lot of sensitivity. They don't always necessarily see those kinds of changes. So 58%, pretty close to a coin flip about whether or not you're going to see cognitive change in the post-injury setting. And again, it's a number to remember, because if you look actually at our own data, we found some similar results. So let's talk a little bit about our own data. So we had 3 schools that evaluated SWAY and Impact over a 2-year span of time. So we had Clearview, Lutheran West, and Westlake all did both SWAY and Impact for the 22-24 seasons. We asked them to do a baseline, to do and a more acute administration, so 24 to 48 hours post-injury, and then a clearance evaluation. And again, that was a little different for Impact, because in the past we'd only done just a baseline and a clearance. But to do that, we wanted to see, in the acute phase, how sensitive is SWAY relative to Impact. We wanted to make sure that we're at least getting similar data, because like I said, the tasks of SWAY are really, they're less complicated. They're fairly basic kinds of tasks relative to Impact. And I wasn't sure whether or not that was going to lead to problems with sensitivity or utility that way. So we wanted to look at, how useful is SWAY compared to Impact relative to what we had done in the past, relative to, to other athletes in the post-injury setting. And the thing to hear too is like every time, again, athletic trainer experience with this is really positive. I mean, and I think that's just, again, it shows you that's, giving impact is just pulling teeth with athletes, and they really hate doing it. Which is, again, amusing from my end of things, because in neuropsych, we give you huge, long batteries of tests, and we think of something like computerized testing as being pretty basic. But it's, again, athletes hate doing it. So again, when we were doing the biomarker tests, the athletes would sometimes say, "Oh, I'm fine giving the blood draw, but I'm never taking that test again." So again, it was the giving impact has always been a problem for people. But again, the athletic trainer experience with Sway has always been very, very positive. And that was true again with the trial that we did here. So one of the first things that we did was to look at just basic correlations. So how correlated is Sway relative to impact? And so again, we asked people to give baselines, and we recognized that the Sway baseline was not always done particularly near the impact baseline. So sometimes that Sway baseline was done 6 months, out from the impact baseline. Sometimes it's within a week, and sometimes it was actually done on the same day. And so that's what we're looking at here. We had upwards of 400 plus athletes that we were looking at that had been given both Sway and impact at baseline. And what you see here is that the balance testing, and we actually could do this. This is just the single leg stance, but you can look at this across each one of them, and they were all the same. So the best balance testing was not correlated really with anything on impact. As you might expect, it's a totally different kind of thing. Right. So, I mean, so looking at balance is not necessarily related. And again, this is at baseline. It's not in the post-injury setting. So it really is just looking at something totally different. But what's also interesting is that the reaction time measures on Sway were also pretty different. It didn't matter whether or not we're talking about same day administration or 6 months out administration. There is some very mild correlation between impact reaction time and the Sway reaction time, but that's a pretty limited effect. So those are pretty small effects. The only reason we're getting the significance there is because we have hundreds of people in that sample. It really is just, even though it's looking at a basic kind of reaction time task, doing it on your phone versus doing it on a laptop or a computer is just different, is basically what that's telling us. And then if we look at inspection time, there's more correlations. So again, if you remember, this is the one where you're choosing between the two different tests. Again, there's more correlations, but those numbers are not particularly high. I mean, it's actually correlated with several of the impact tasks. But it's again still different from what impact is measuring in some ways. And again, it didn't matter whether or not it was 6 months out or the same day. If you're looking at impulse control, again, similar sort of findings. And if you're looking at the memory testing, probably the highest correlations that we're seeing were with memory. Interesting, and they're not on the memory tests. They're actually in the vision motor tests. So it's really more of a kind of a visual scanning, visual processing sort of thing. If you remember, it's the Simon Says kind of task where you are kind of visually scanning on that. So again, that's better correlated there, but it's still not really highly correlated. Kind of a correlation that is considered a clinically high meaningful correlation. It's more like 0.7. So again, and if you actually look at, so Sway has a white paper where they have done correlations of their own tests with other tests. Again, this is from the publisher, so I'm always a little bit hesitant and cautious when I'm taking some of this data. But actually, their data aligns pretty well with the stuff that we're seeing. If anything, they're showing maybe a little bit of a stronger correlation with some of their tests, and so like 0.4s we're seeing in there. Which we didn't really get in our own data, but really for the most part, we're seeing pretty similar things where they're saying they're not all that correlated. So again, I think the bottom line from all of that is saying that really Sway measures something different. And it makes sense because the modality is so different. So what does that mean then for the actual post-injury data? So, unfortunately, even though we had 400 plus athletes, there were not that many who were given tests really close to each other. And you know the way concussion is, concussions that are even just a few days different from each other, that person can be in a different phase of recovery. And so we wanted people to be given the post-injury tests either the same day or right around that time. And so finding that was a hard thing to do. We did have several that we were looking at. And just to kind of orient you to this table, so a plus means that you had positive findings, meaning that you saw significant changes. And I've got both impact and performance, as well as the impact symptom scale, and then the ultimate decision of whether or not you would want to be holding that athlete out based on whether or not they had change in performance or if they were endorsing symptoms according to just impact. And then over here, then there's also then the sway performance and the sway symptom scale, and then the ultimate decision of whether or not you want to hold that athlete out. This is based on acute findings. So these are times where a person has been pulled out, they've been diagnosed with a concussion, they've having these evaluations done within, again, we were asking 48 hours, and most of the time it was within at least a couple days. Hopefully it was even sooner than that. But these are people that you would expect them to have problems on testing. And what's interesting is that, so first of all, there was 100% consistency in the data that we got. If you're using both performance and symptoms, so that you'd be holding each one of these athletes out if you were using both the performance and the symptoms for either impact or sway. So 100% of the time we'd be doing that. What's interesting, if you're using just the cognitive testing alone, impact only identified significant changes in about 50% of the athletes. Whereas sway, it was more like 70% of the athletes were identified as having a significant change. That's very consistent with the data that sway provided, and said that when you look at those college athletes, I think it was 58% and 70%. And so, again, that's very consistent with the information that we got from them too. There were 4 of 10 cases actually that we had where impact composites did not decline and sway did decline. And then there were 2 cases, and I'm going to show you one, where actually sway did not decline, but impact did. So we're going to go through, and I'm going to show you just a handful of these real quick as examples of some of the things. And this actually will show you what some of the reports look like as well. And then after that, again, we'll go through and we'll talk about kind of recommendations for administration and how we interpret some of this stuff too. So this is an example of where both impact and sway aligned. So you get the impact testing up top. That again, remember the bolding is saying there's a significant difference. You can see that we've had the administration of both impact and sway around the same times. There's still a couple days different from each other, but again, both symptoms and the performance are declined. You can see the little red declines on the sway composite. That's showing you that it is a decline relative to the baseline. And then the red bolds up top are saying that there's a decline there, and they both had symptom endorsement. And then, a few weeks later, actually, 3 weeks later, there's no symptoms endorsed at that time, but actually both sway and impact are still showing some cognitive changes. So again, that's one where both the testing and the symptom endorsement are aligning for both of the tasks. This is one where sway and impact align early, but they don't necessarily align later. So again, early on, so this was done on the same day, we have symptom endorsement, you have significant declines for both. And then later on, there's no symptom endorsement and there's no change on impact, but there actually are some changes here on sway. Now, one of the things to keep in mind too, in this kind of scenario, if this was something that happened with you, so again, you've got no symptom endorsement, you've got a couple declines, Well, one of the things to think about too is that you actually don't have declines on either the balance testing or the reaction time, which are the most studied composites on SWAY. So I mean that's something to think about. That said, again, if you had some concerns, it would be something where you would probably want to repeat that. If it's something where you feel like, what, I don't see why there's any kind of reason for this. You could actually think about giving it right away again and just make sure that you actually get the same kind of reliable findings. Again, what's nice about SWAY is it takes about 5 minutes to give it, and it's not that big of a deal. Okay. Here's one where the athlete was pretty symptomatic, showing a pretty high degree of symptoms. And SWAY showed some changes, showed some declines, and Impact never really showed declines. And so, again, you can see pretty high degrees of symptom endorsement early on after this injury. And Impact performance. So the January 12th one, for whatever reason, they didn't give SWAY. They just gave the symptom scale. That was probably the day of injury. But they did give an Impact. Again, there was no decline relative to baseline, but they were endorsing pretty high degrees of symptoms. And then when they actually did give the cognitive testing, SWAY did show a change. Oh, and then if you actually when they gave it again a week later, both of them normalized. So again, now there's no symptoms endorsed at all, and there's still no decline. So there was really never a decline on Impact for that athlete. But there was one that happened with SWAY, and then it actually normalized. This is an unusual one where, again, like I said, there were two cases where Impact showed declines, but SWAY did not. And what's interesting with this one is that the baselines were done they were done at two different times. So one was a year apart from the other one. And what you can see is that at Impact on the August 22 baseline, there was relatively little symptom endorsement, but in August of 23, there was a very high degree of symptom endorsement. And when we went through, and I actually opened up this athlete's file and I took a look at it just in Epic just to see what was going on with them. And it was around that time that they were diagnosed with anxiety, and they also were diagnosed with ADHD. I assumed that they had ADHD to begin with, but they were both anxiety and ADHD were diagnosed between 2022 and 2023, which likely accounts for this significant increase in symptom endorsement. And then when in the post-injury setting, we see substantial declines now in all of these Impact test scores, and we don't see it in SWAY, and that's likely because it was administered, more recently. And it's another reason for why more frequent administration of baselining like this will help us to get a better read on athletes. And again, the logistical side of things makes SWAY easier for that to be done. It does raise an interesting question of whether or not those more complex tasks that are done with Impact they're sensitive but not specific to concussion. I wonder whether or not the more basic ones might be a little more specific to concussion on SWAY. It's hard to know that, and that's not been something that's been done, but I think it's definitely some data we can maybe look at with our athletes over time. Okay.
Chris, is there a trend in SWAY not being as sensitive for those who have like ADHD and anxiety like Impact is?
It makes you wonder, but those studies have not been done. Like I said, I think that's definitely something we'll want to probably do. We're going to have a lot of athletes. Hopefully we'll be able to identify the ones that actually do have ADHD and some anxiety and other things like that. And we can look at it with baselines, and we should have a very large number of people to look to see, hey, are we seeing a lot of problems on testing in these kids? It would be useful. It would be very useful from a concussion management standpoint if we had a test that was more specific to concussion. I can tell you in the neuropsych world, that is a very hard thing to find because concentration is pretty core to both concussion and those kinds of problems. So, again, it would be surprising to some degree, but, again, if you're talking about just basic reaction time, maybe that is something that would be a better measure. It's hard to know. Okay, so what did this tell us? Again, there's reasonable empirical support. They're measuring just different things. if using both cognitive performance and symptom endorsement. I think that's the important thing to do. Again, with concussion, you shouldn't be focusing on just one thing. You should be looking at multiple modalities. If you're doing both things, then we're getting consistent information, especially in the acute phase. And maybe Sway is at times showing even a little bit of a better, again, even a little bit higher degree of sensitivity than what Impact did. Relative to Impact and relative to the athletes that we have. And again, we only had a very small number of people that we looked at that over, but it does reasonably align with information that we've gotten from the publisher on this too. Okay, so let's talk about administration interpretation. So a lot of this is just going to be some general guidelines on things to be thinking about. And we met. So Suze and I and Chris Tangen and Paul all met and thought about like what are the kinds of things we want to do for our athletic trainers, and what do we want to think about for how we want to give Sway to, across the system in general. And we talked about what are the minimum. So again, we're encouraging that you can give it to whoever you want to give it to, but what are the teams that we really want to focus on? To make sure everybody is giving. So like I said, compliance was a big problem with something like Impact. And I don't think we realized how big of a problem it actually was until we went through and actually started looking at some of the data to think about whether or not Sway was really an option we want to look at. So we're expecting actually to have a significant increase in the usage of our computerized testing with Sway. And I think that that's probably what we're going to see. We'll dive into that, but these are the teams that we're recommending that people focus on. Basically, ones that are at risk for having some sort of concussion, and even kind of milder risk. So not necessarily ones that So baseball is on there, and some of the track and field jumpers too. So what are the things that people should be doing to prepare and to give baselines? First of all, is to make sure you're actually familiar with what you're doing. And so, like I said, that link that I provided for the Sway University is a very good thing to go through and look at that. There actually are specific videos that Sway did for training too. Paul has those, I believe. I'm not sure where those are actually saved, but we did have some Zoom calls where the Sway people provided a presentation to us. I think something to hear about both the Sway University videos and our own sort of guidelines is that Sway actually is recommending people do some things that I feel like are a little more conservative and not necessarily some of the stuff that we would always want to do. So again, we're gonna give some different recommendations than what they would, but it's definitely a place to start, and it's not they're not. You're not going to do bad things, essentially, if you're following what they're doing. I think that actually, if anything, you're going to be repeating baseline testing a little more often and stuff like that than what I would say you would really need to. So always this should be done in a controlled setting with observed medical staff. So, I mean, again, even though you could do some of this kind of stuff at home, I would never recommend doing it. You're always going to get better data by having people there observing what's going on. And we're telling people to give baselines every year. And like I said, we saw why that was. There are some times where things occur in athletes' lives, within this time frame, and giving it every year, I think we're going to get a more reliable estimate. And there are even practice effects that people see across years on some of these things. We're recommending that people start with 10 athletes at a time to give when they're first kind of getting used to it. Once they're feeling really comfortable, they can move up to 20 athletes if they wanted to, but we're telling people probably not to go much above that. Sway doesn't have recommendations for that, but that 10 and 20 guideline is what has been shown in the past for other computerized tests, and I think it's a reasonable sort of guideline to start with. Avoid giving that kind of test when people are super tired, essentially, when they're just coming out of practice. Fatigue is something that we honestly don't know how it affects Sway specifically, but in the past, that has been a problem with cognitive testing, and it's just intuitive that it probably would affect it.
Chris, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Because balance is such a large component. I did my practice a while ago, so I can't remember. Does it take in any information about lower extremity injuries at all?
Yeah, that is a good question. And actually, it's something that Paul has really hoped we could start to use this for, like, ankle and a variety of other things too. I don't believe that there is data that exists about that. And I don't think that they are taking in that information necessarily. It is a good point that probably if somebody has like an ankle injury or something that they're recovering from, that they might want to get a baseline again later on once they're once they're not hurting when they're taking that.
Yep. I had a patient this week who is a soccer player and she's recovering from an adductor strain. She's still on crutches, so we deferred her taking her sway baseline until she feels better.
Yeah, I mean, you can also do everything but. So you can actually, so the Sport Plus is one of the things that's also very useful about Sway. And again, it takes a little bit of familiarity with it, but you can choose whatever test you want to give. So you don't have to give all of the tests. In unlike Impact, where basically it's all the same thing. You can pick and choose, and there actually are other tests than the ones I showed you that are a part of the Sway battery. They're just not a part of the ones that are part of this, what we call the Sport Plus battery. So you could choose to give all of the cognitive tests, the reaction time, the other things, except for the best, and then just add a best later on. So you can go through and do that if you want to. Again, it takes a little bit of knowledge to figure out how to go through and give it. It's not that hard though. Basically, you go through and you select the test that you want to give, and it sends a code to the kid, and they just like load in the code, and then it gives whatever test you tell them to give. Sport Plus is just one that's automatically chosen, essentially. So reliability is a thing to talk about, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to look at this. So again, this is basically what Impact would do is when it would flag people's baseline as being invalid. So this is the way that Sway goes about doing that. So basically, when you give a test, there are different colors of what they call consistency, and what they're looking at is, so like you said, a lot of times, so they'll give you either 2 or 3 tests. So Sway chooses to give 2 or 3 tests based on how close those tests are to each other. So if something is reliable, even if it's not necessarily a good score, then you're going to get like a green score. So that green dot tells you that the tests were close to each other that they gave. Sometimes they give you just 2 tests, and these 2 are close enough that they don't need to give you a third. Sometimes they'll say, you know what, these 2 are not as close as what we would want them to be, so they'll give you a third. And even if all 3 of them are bad, then you'll go through and get things like these yellow and red scores. Another thing to keep in mind, so the gray bar there is telling you not necessarily whether or not it's reliable, it's telling you your performance relative to the norm. And I'll show you an example of these here in just a second. But the thing to hear is that the full gray bar, so the dark gray to the light gray and then back to the dark gray, that full bar is 10th to 90th percentile for the normative sample. And even though 10th percentile sounds low and 90th percentile sounds high, 10th to 90th percentile is low average to high average in terms of how we think about it as neuropsychologists. That is broad average range. That is not a problematic or concerning degree of performance. Less than 10th percentile or higher than 90th percentile are strong or weak performances. So that is broad average and is pretty normal for people. We all have scores that fall into the broad average range on the tests that we give. I guarantee you I would have broad average performance on several of these tests. So again, that's not necessarily something where I feel like is a concerning sort of pattern. And we're going to talk about kind of what to do. So here's an example of an athlete that has a few of these kinds of tests where if I gave this baseline and I saw that, I'd want to pull that up and take a look at what was going on with that athlete. This is an example here of what a reliable test would look like. So this is their balance for that athlete. And what you can see is that really most of these tests are pretty consistent with each other. And so because they're consistent, the little green sort of bar that's underneath the gray bar is showing you the range of where that athlete's performances were. for this test. So the best testing has a 0 to 100 range that they go through and give you. And what you can see is that this person did pretty well. He's at the 80th percentile, or she's at the 80th percentile. And they were reasonably consistent with each other. And so again, you can see that it's at the 80th percentile because that other gray bar that's above it is the normative sample for everybody else. So it's at the high end of that gray bar. Now, this is an example of an athlete that is currently falling towards the bottom of the normative sample. So they're at the 10th percentile. So they're at the very bottom of the dark gray bar. And you can see that there's a range. It's red because there's a range of scores. So this person had 3 tests. One was a 64, one was a 25, and one was a 70. Well, if you go through and edit this test you click the edit button, and then you can choose, do I want to eliminate one of these tests because it's an outlier from one of the other ones? If you do that, now what you get is an average score that's really, very close to the average range. Somewhere in the dead center really is the average to low average sort of range of things relative to norms. That is one where I would not do a repeat of that test. I would just eliminate the outlier and then use the average there. Again, if you're thinking about this kind of testing relative to what we would do with something like impact is something where, we would actually go through and only get one test. You wouldn't get multiple tests like this. So this is far more reliable now than what it was when we were doing something like impact. We had 2 administrations. This is an example here of where you get, again, you have a clear outlier. You have one that's a 34 millisecond. It's actually very fast. So they had one test that was very fast. Now, what's interesting is if I remove that one very fast test, you still actually, you still have some randomness, or not, you still have, well, actually, you have, if I went through and removed the one that was very slow, I guess, is what I did with this one. You still have a significant range, but now the performance is falling still pretty normal. Again, you can choose. I've been telling athletic trainers that have been reaching out for this, that, what do I do in this situation where I've got ones where they're not that close, but they're still kind of normal in terms of their average performance. That's one where it's up to you if you've got the time and you want to give it again, or you feel like you want to try to improve the accuracy of this. You could try to give it again. If you're getting a normal overall score, though, I don't see that as being something where you'd absolutely have to give it again. This is an example of one where you get low scores. So this person's at the very bottom of again, it's at the 9th percentile. It's actually below the gray bar range. And they're unreliable to begin with. And it really doesn't matter what test I eliminate here, I'm still going to have low performance. So the one that's kind of an outlier is this 358 millisecond ones. You have 2 scores then that are 1st percentile or less that are left over. That's probably one I'd want to go through and give again. So what I'm telling people in general with this is that if you see somebody do something like they drop their phone or do something weird when they're giving the test, then probably you need to repeat it. So that's, again, if you see something weird happen, then repeat the test. I wouldn't worry at all about the yellow dots. If you see a red dot, then the red dot is probably something to do something with. If we're thinking about performances, I would be more focused also on the ones that are outside of the normal ranges. So things that are unusual. And for the outliers, the scores that are just significantly different from the others. If you can exclude the outlier and then it normalizes performance, then don't repeat it. And if you exclude the outlier and there's really, it still lands outside of the normal time, the normal performance range, then that's the time to think about repeating. So, I think the thing to hear is that we don't necessarily want everyone to be repeating tests all the time. I think that's not ideal. It's not necessarily the way to go about doing it. And the thing to hear is that we're getting better reliability with this kind of testing format, no matter what. Okay, so I can see we're getting short on time, but we can talk about suspected injury and what do you want to do with it? So first of all, don't ever give a screening. So there's an option for screening. Basically, what screening is a briefer administration of testing, and don't ever do it on sidelines. So don't use Sway for decisions about whether or not to be removing athletes. Use your normal protocol for that kind of stuff. Sway testing, it should be done in a controlled setting. It shouldn't be done on the sideline ever. We're going to recommend that people give a symptom scale early on, so day of injury. And again, that could be Sway, it could be SCAT, whatever, or it could be the normal PCS, whatever you want to do, but we want people to try to get a sense of symptom endorsement early. And then within 72 hours, and again, this is a little different than what we've done with Impact in the past, I think it makes sense with Sway that we get an acute evaluation. So relatively early, we want people to the next time they're basically in the training room to go through and actually give a Sway. You can do SCAT if you want as well. I would make sure that you're giving Sway as a way to just monitor what the person's recovery over time looks like. Again, it's not a hard thing to give. We're not billed as a system based on the number of administrations. So actually using it a little more fully, I think, makes sense.
Chris, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I remember, like, data-wise with Impact, we used to say like 80% of people will have an abnormal impact while they're still symptomatic, but like about 20% of people can have cognitive recovery before symptom recovery. And that always muddies the waters, right? So like once in a blue moon, we'd get in a kid who was symptomatic, who's like, I passed my impact test. Why can't I play?
Yeah.
Do you think we're going to see something similar with this, where we're going to have kids who are symptomatic at that 72-hour mark, but they're still going to pass?
I think it's possible. So I think that, again, if you looked at what the data we had for those 10, that happened 30% of the time. It happened 50% of the time with Impact.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think the thing here is the combination of symptoms and performance, in my mind, need to be normal before so if a person was symptomatic at that time, I would lean on the symptoms. If their cognitive performance is pretty symptomatic at that time, that's pretty early following injury, and they're not reporting symptoms, then I would again, just kind of based on base rate alone, I'd be concerned about that, and I would want them to repeat and kind of follow the normal protocol of things. If you get the acute administration, I mean, that's not really a clearance eval. You're just getting a sense of where are you at now. And then when they're feeling better and when they're at the place, again, they've already done a little bit of the exercise protocol and you repeat at that point, then you should see improvement over time. It's going to allow you to kind of follow that recovery curve over time.
I guess what's the benefit of that information?
So I think that what it's going to do is potentially, and what it has done in the past, is it's going to help us to identify people that are at risk for a lot of problems. So if a person in that early acute phase has a symptom scale that is, 100, and they have a lot of cognitive problems, then that's somebody that probably we need to plan on getting to PT sooner rather than later, and maybe even getting over to neuropsych. So you're going to identify people that are at risk for and unquestionably, poor early symptom endorsement, poor acute cognitive performance is related to worse, longer recovery times in general. We knew that actually with Impact too. It's just, it costs us a good bit of money to do that every time. And the symptom scale does a pretty good job on itself for us to identify that. So again, just giving a symptom scale tells us that. But adding in the cognitive data would also add in another piece, and it's not a hard thing to do.
And so for those people, are you suggesting that what do we do differently with them? Do we get them more urgently into physical therapy? Like, what should we do if they do look like they're performing more poorly cognitively at 72 hours?
I mean, if everything's down early, and again, there's a lot of symptoms early, then like I said, that's somebody that I would think, yeah, probably sooner rather than later, let's get you into rehab. And like I said, I mean, it might be something where they follow up and ask. I mean, that's somebody that maybe they have a significant history of depression or anxiety. Maybe they have other kinds of things. And if that's the case, then yeah, maybe get them to neuropsych and we can help to kind of connect them to things. But it's probably a person to follow up on and say, hey, what else is going on? Is it just this injury or is there something else? Because I would expect that the people that are the most symptomatic and the most problematic on testing are going to be ones that would benefit from additional intervention. So I know we're running late with timing on this. Do people have time to stick around and do some more? I can, if people can.
I definitely
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
How many more slides do you have? If
Just
people have,
just a few.
okay. Yeah. If
To go
people
through
have
and
to
show some
hop
things.
off, I will forward the lecture off to people who are on the email distribution list for Friday lectures. I don't think there's anybody else on the talk who's not, but if you are, please feel free to email me or tell one of the attendings and we'll get the talk to you.
So again, even though we're going to give it early, what I would say also is make sure we're also giving it again at clearance. So again, we want to have a normal performance and a normal symptom endorsement before people return. And this has come up here just recently with a few people. If somebody has something that's more severe, so actual structural brain injury, contusion, hemorrhage, diffuse axonal injury, anything like that, don't be using sway. So sway is not what you should be doing. At that point, you need to get in the specialist evaluation. And that's a person that needs to go to neurosurgery. They need to be doing other things. And then they're going to go to do like a full neuropsych before they're getting back to play. So again, sway is something to be used not in these more complex kinds of situations. So in terms of how we look at how we're actually going to look at the data, again, it is going to be very similar to what it is that we look at for impact as well. So as a reminder, when we give testing like this, we're always looking at the bell curve. So we're always looking at the normal range of performance. And what our testing often tells us is where within that normal curve this athlete's performing. So if I go through and I give a test, and they perform at the 7th percentile, what that means is that relative to other athletes who have taken the test when they are not injured, their performance is, in a room of 100 people, worse than 93 of them if they're at the 70th percentile. So that's a performance that in and of itself is weak and is something that is probably concerning. And so the sway data go through and it gives us the sense of things like that. So like I said, this is an athlete's performance on inspection time. You get the raw score, that's the 68 that's showing you there. But underneath that, you can see there is a percentile, and it's saying it's at the 42nd percentile. You can also see that on the gray bar, right? So the gray bar that's there, the light gray is the solidly average. The dark gray is the low average to high average, and this person's fallen pretty much in the dead center of that. So that is an average range performance. But we also don't look just at whether or not the person is average compared to the normative sample. We also want to look at how is that athlete's performance relative to themselves. So if we're thinking about this athlete's performance as being pretty close to the average of the normative sample, and that's their current performance, if we know that their pre-injury performance, their baseline, was significantly higher than that, then that could still mean that this is, even though it's normal, it's not normal for that athlete, that they have a relative strength in this skill, and it's a significant decline from that. So again, if we're thinking about baseline testing, what we would expect with baselines in general is that they would establish what the reference point is, and then if they have an injury, when we administer the test, there should be a meaningful change in the acute administration, and over time, that should improve. And by the end, often the athletes are a little bit better than what they were to begin with. And when we go through and give tests like this, the problem is that reliability of the test varies by the type of test that we give. And so unfortunately, when I give a test 100 times, I expect 100 different results, even if I give it to the same athlete. So you'll go through and see some changes that occur, and how close they are to that performance. Again, it's going to vary a little bit. It's going to vary around an average score. And sometimes those averages so the reliability test is pretty good. Sometimes the reliability test is not that good. And there's going to be pretty massive swings between one day I give it and the next time I give it. And so there's metrics that we use to think about what is a meaningful change. Well, the way sway is set up and what it actually does is they've identified raw score differences that are meaningful changes for them. So what actually bolds on the sway sort of metrics is if there is a 15% change in the raw score performance on several of the tests, and then the one inspection time actually uses a specific amount of milliseconds. That's based on the reliability of that. They actually have developed reliability change scores. So we actually do have these. They're not built into the reports that people get at this point, but you can go through and calculate those if you want to. Again, when we were looking at it and evaluating sway relative to impact, we were using the built-in metrics. So I was using the stuff that turned red essentially on sway. But you can actually look at the RCI changes if you want to, and I'll forward this information on to people so they have it. It's another way to look at it. Some of the RCIs are they're more conservative. Some of them are actually less conservative than what the publishers have already identified. So it kind of varies about that. But again, if you see somebody that's kind of borderline and you're not sure whether or not, or you get stuff that doesn't align, so the symptoms are different or the cognitive performance is different, you could actually also look at the RCIs and see, does that align better? That would be another way to consider it. These are changes relative, so they're changes in the raw scores. These are not changes in anything like percentiles, is the way to think about it. So this is that athlete that we were looking at before. So again, relative to the baseline, so this is, again, she had a 42nd percentile performance here. You can see the green bar there. That's actually where that person's baseline was. That baseline average was actually on the high end of normal, somewhere in the upper 80s percentile. That is actually a significant change for that athlete relative to the baseline. And this is the way that it shows up. And actually, it will go through and also on the report show you all of the performances that you want to add to it, similar to impact. So this is actually what we would want to do for most of the athletes that we'd have. So the block here is the baseline that the person did. The January 12th is one where they just gave a symptom scale and gave you the example of the symptoms. The January 16th was one that was done more acutely, the cognitive performance, and you can see that there's less symptoms than what there were on the day of injury, and there was a meaningful decline like the one I showed you. And then within a week or so after that, they repeated, and all the symptoms normalized and all of the tests normalized. So they're no longer, so the gray components, when that's gray, that's saying that's not different from baseline. And actually all of them, most of them are actually a little bit above baseline, which is exactly the sort of pattern that you would expect to see. And the other thing that's really important to consider is, again, the symptoms. Don't ignore the symptoms. The symptoms are listed there, but if you actually just look at the scale, you see this same sort of pattern of progressive improvement over time in symptoms. So if people have a second, I can actually open up the Sway app. And show people. You guys are not, you probably can't. Can you see my screen? Let me actually share my screen. I don't think I shared my screen. Okay, you guys can actually see that now, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So this is what Sway looks like, the desktop version of it. And this is that athlete.
Can you back up into like how you find people? Like maybe just go to the main menu and start there so we know how to pull people up.
So right here, so there's the dashboard, and it's to be. Oh shoot. Okay.
My bad.
No, but that's helpful, Suze. We're starting from the beginning.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah. Let me see if I can remember my password. Nope. Hold on. Oh, come on. Oh, it's because I misspelled my. Come on.
I hope we have to go through dual authorization to get in.
Yeah, I
So
really
you-
want to use a Google Authenticator code
Oh,
for
come
this.
on.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, I'm hoping it goes through Duo.
It's my favorite.
Awesome.
Yeah. Or we could use a Google Authenticator code to get into Duo to then authenticate. That would be fun too.
There is something, I think the first time you give it. Okay, so there you go. So when you first start up, you should have all of your schools. Now I have every school that's here, but I think that Paul only set people up. I don't remember if every doc has access to every school. I think maybe that's what they did. The athletic trainers only have access to their school. So I think that when he set people up, he was setting it up because in case somebody comes into clinic.
Yeah, that would make sense.
So I think that's the way they set it up. I think that the person I'm talking about was a Clearview. What is going on? Let's try this again. There you go. So this one already pulled up because I was looking at it, but you can just, once you log into it, it shows you, yeah. So this shows you all of the most recent things that have happened for that school. Okay, so it's showing you the recent activity over here. Those are different recent profiles. There's no open events currently, meaning that nobody's actively in the concussion protocol for that school. If you want to just search for a profile, you can search by name, and that actually searches all of the profiles. And it's not just, so you can see there's Lutheran West, there's things that are in here that are not the school I'm currently looking at. It searches everybody. And you can do it by name. You can also do it, this number here is the unique number for the athlete. And so if you ever had a question and you're asking Sway about things, they're going to ask you for the number. They're not going to ask you for the name because they don't actually have access to the personal information. So this was the athlete that we were looking at just a minute ago. I'm going to go through and create a report. So for whatever reason, this athlete has taken this test a ton of times. So they gave this test a ton to this kid. So when you go through to create a report, you can create a password protected report. I'm currently not. So if you go through and add a password here, then to open up the PDF, you're going to have to put in the password. I'm not going to do that right now. But basically, the selected test, the one that's on this screen, is the one that it's going to make the comparison to. And you can see this person's had a ton of administrations. The one that we were looking at here is January 24th. So I'm going to use the January 24th of 23. So that's the one that is the one that's going to show up the most. And then on top of that, I want to include other tests. So I want to include, I want to include not all of these because there's just tons of them. And actually, you know what? Just to show you, I'm just going to create one with everything. So what it'll do is it's going to show that January 24th result. So this is what their performance is. And it starts out to begin with where it's just going to show you kind of an overall view of what the individual subtest performances look like. So it'll show you that. Then it's going to break it down into, so this is that individual subtest, but now you can actually see each one of the separate factors that lead to that performance. If that was given multiple times on that day, it would show you multiple administrations and all that kind of stuff. But again, it's still showing you the performance for the 24th. And then as you keep going down, then now here is the one that shows you that performance relative to any other test that was given that you were selecting to include in that report. And like I said, for whatever reason, this person's had it a ton of times. So because that's a lot of stuff, and so honestly, if you wanted to, you could just kind of skip down to this box, but there's too many things there for this person to be shown. So what I'm going to do is to create a different report, and I'm going to go through now, and I'm going to use the 24th, but I'm going to include just the subtest, just the administrations that I want to look at. So I'm going to deselect the ones that I don't want to see. And I think the ones that we used were the 18th, if I remember correctly. It was the
Chris,
18th.
how do you know which ones to deselect?
So I don't know why this person had it this many.
Okay, so most people shouldn't have that many.
No, most people I would think would only have it 3 times, right? They should have it a baseline. They should have the time at the time of the injury, and then they should have one that was a clearance. Like why this person had it this many times, I have no idea. Um, so
So if we
and
have a case like this, we should just randomly select dates to, like,
mean,
is there a reason you're omitting specific date or
I'm
specific
doing the
tests?
ones just because I remember this was what we actually looked at the last time. Again, probably what I would do the first time is to do all of them, like what it was. It's a little overwhelming, but then once you look at them, then you can decide which ones you feel like are meaningful. And like I said, this is showing the 24th, but this then now provides the just the dates that I wanted to look at, and it just makes it much more manageable instead of having that huge list of stuff. But you have the baseline, you have the symptom scale that was done on the date of injury, then you have the acute administration, then you have the clearance administration. Again, you can put on there whatever you want. I just did it that way because it's a little, like I said, it's a little more manageable. And it does describe what are the meaningful changes here. And then, like I said, if I felt like I really wanted to kind of do an RCI evaluation, then what I would want to do is just to go through and make those calculations. So you can compare baseline relative to that, whether or not there was this degree of decline. The 80th percent confidence interval tends to be the one that most people use when identifying what is a meaningful change. So, like I said, I could go through and calculate. So, is 92 different from 88, and is that at a threshold that is meaningful? Again, this is already telling you that from a percentage standpoint that it's not that different, but that's not the same thing as like a true kind of reliable change kind of performance. It's just that's a more sophisticated way to look at it. Again, I think just relying on what's bolding is not an unreasonable way to do it, at least for now. Okay, so that was a whole lot of info. I'm going to stop share. Do people have questions? Do people want to talk more about some of these things? I mean, I think the other thing that's worth, reminding everybody of, I'll share my screen again here. Is, this, that, when to get us involved. If you have questions, and people are going to have questions with Sway, I have access to this stuff. I'm happy to take a look. It's not that hard for me to take a look. So if there's any kind of questions about what's going on, just reach out. So email me, text me. I'm happy to take a look if people aren't sure what to do with it. And again, I'm aware early on there's going to be more of that, and that's okay. I would say other times, like I said, if we're seeing a person has a significant complex history of things, if they have ADHD or LD, if they have a history of a bunch of neurological issues, if they're considering retirement, these are all times where it really makes sense to get neuropsych involved too. But like I said, I think early on having a higher threshold for getting us involved because you're not sure what to do, again, that's okay.
I think
Other
most
questions
of us
or
will
anything
probably
else?
be calling you when we have our first couple Sway patients, Chris.
Sure, and that's fine.
And it'll probably get easier as we start looking at it. It's just a little hard to interpret what exactly
Like I
we're
said,
looking at.
the thing to hear is similar to impact. Look at percentage, look at percentile to begin with. And again, low percentile is bad. And I would say, again, thinking less than 10th percentile. So when that happens, especially if that wasn't true at baseline, even if it's telling you that it's not that different, that's still a meaningful thing to be aware of. So less than 10 percentiles is a thing to look at, and change from baseline are things to look at. Don't ignore the symptom endorsement. Those are all things. This, again, it's the stuff that you were already doing with impact. I think the hardest thing is just to get used to figuring out how to show the results, how to create a form the way you want to, and create the report the way you want to. You know, the figuring out how to administer things and that kind of stuff, again, for the athletic trainers. Like I said, that's the stuff that's going to take a minute. Once you do that, and again, just go in and play around with it a little bit. Once you go in and do that stuff, I think it's going to, again, everybody's experience with it in general has been very, very positive. Like I said, if anything, I was trying to not be biased by the fact that people talk about how easy to use it is. Well, I had you 20 minutes extra. Sorry, people. So if there's anything else, you know, feel free to reach out. Again, I'm happy to go over things with people. I'm happy to talk about it. And if there's, you know, something else that people want me to do, just let me know.
Thanks, Chris. Maybe we'll think about like if one of us has a patient that we choose, we could maybe do a Zoom link with everybody and have you kind of help us set up what we're looking at.
Sure. Yeah, we could do like a kind of, maybe we could do a couple, you know, case reviews or case series if people have some interesting ones that we want to talk about.
Yeah, but I think like maybe having us try to figure out how to navigate the program with your guidance, I think it'd give us a lot more confidence. So
Sure.
we'll throw that idea out there and see if that might work.
Sounds good.
Chris, can I ask one other question?
Sure.
What about surface? So have the athletic trainers been told like not to do this on turf? Is it like take your football guys and do it on the track, or take your soccer team and do it in the gym?
So there hasn't been clear difference to being on one surface versus another, at least that like it's not a published thing. I think that what is common is that people are often doing it prior to practice for baselines. So again, that whatever surface that is, that tends to be where people are doing it from a baseline standpoint, because they can get a good number of people there together at that time. Honestly, like I said, I mean, it would be an interesting question to see if like the post-injury administration, where they're probably going to do it in a training room, whether or not that's different. I mean, in general, when we you know, when we've told people to do testing in the past, we've always tell them that you want to try to keep the circumstances of testing to be very similar.
Yeah.
So that, you know, again, we could tell people only do it in the athletic training room. It's just going to really reduce how often or how able they are to actually go through and get the baseline.
Yeah. I was just thinking about more like make sure you're always on a firm surface, you know, like I'm thinking like my college kid.
Doing it on a trampoline.
Yeah, well, no, just like my college kid, I found her, you know, doing her sway in the upstairs hall room last week. And now she's going to school, and I know if she has a head injury, she'll be repeating a sway on grass.
Right.
So, you know, different surface. That would be to her disadvantage versus the kids who are maybe doing their baseline in a large group out on a football field.
Yeah, I think it's more likely that that's probably what they're going to be doing, and then post injury they'll do it in a training room.
In which case they'll be at a little bit of an advantage.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. Again, it's not something I'm curious. It's possible that Sway has looked at this. I don't know the data behind it. I guarantee you they've got. I mean, again, if they've got several thousand organizations using it, they've got a lot of athletes, and they would have had athletes on different surfaces doing it. I don't know how aware they are of what the surface is and whether or not they've ever actually taken a look at it. These are pretty data-minded people. So Grant Iverson is the chief science officer for this, and Grant is a really well-known neuropsychologist that does a lot of, he's hundreds and hundreds of publications. So I wouldn't be surprised if they've thought about some of that kind of stuff. Okay, well, very good. Well, I'm not going to keep people longer. So again, if you have questions or anything else, just reach out. I'm happy to do what I can. And again, if we want to go through and have people play around with it some while I'm around, I'm happy to do that.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Okay, we'll see you guys later.